Let's hear what the conservative side typically says about cities in America.
We've been talking here a lot about the war overseas, but we are also, as you know, fighting a war right here at home for the streets of our cities.
And there was even once a wave of conspiracy theories emerging that targeted the concept of the 15-minute city during the pandemic. Now, here is what a renowned progressive urbanist on YouTube, his name is City Nerd, thinks of Republicans in general.
A bunch of vile right-wing influencers who use overt racism and sexism to activate the lizard brains of people who are desperate for someone else to blame for their own unhappiness.
You see, the two sides are very polarized nowadays. It doesn't seem there's much space for compromises. Or is there? Because here I am. I'm a staunch conservative urbanist, and I can give a whole speech justifying my seemingly contradictory beliefs. And if you have watched my earlier video, you know the cities are becoming more conservative anyway. Let's talk about it. Welcome back to my channel. You see, my channel is in such a small niche, as I usually talk about issues that is usually the progressive urban left who loves to talk about, such as environmental conservation, urbanism, and transit. But I examine these issues through a conservative lens because I am raised socially conservative, but have also experienced the many amazing things that good urbanism has offered me. The two concepts, I really don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that a very important identity associated with us conservatives is that we strive to restore traditions. We believe that if an idea or lifestyle is good and has stood the test of time over hundreds of years, it ought to be preserved. So here's the thing. American cities used to be quite walkable, with the excellent transit services in the first half of the 20th century, until they aren't anymore. On a broader scale, throughout human evolution, we have always walked, ridden horses, or rode boats in order to get around places, if not migrating very long distances. There's a term for that, which is quote-unquote active mobility, where the source of moving power comes from our very own bodies, which is not only healthy, but also environmentally sustainable nowadays. The rise of the automobile in the early to mid-20th century changed everything, however. Air pollution exacerbated in cities, neighborhoods were demolished to make way for highways, only to then be congested, not to mention that people's health conditions worsened, since people drive everywhere instead of having many alternative options. Part of the reason why Robert Kennedy Jr. has become such a superstar of the MAGA movement nowadays is that the conservatives actually do care about the health and environment in America quite a lot, despite being constantly smeared by the liberal media. So my point is, as conservatives who value traditions, what is the right thing to do in this case? I believe it is to bring back how vibrant cities used to be, instead of it being autistically supportive of the quote-unquote American dream kind of suburban developments and lifestyle. You don't always need a lawn, a backyard, and a garage with a driveway. Just think about it. I once had a conversation with a friend of mine regarding the suburban living experience. He thought that his single-family neighborhood environment could provide him privacy, tranquility, and easy access to nature. Obviously, he didn't study environmental science or urban planning, but wasn't politically conservative either, unlike me. But at that moment, I actually didn't know how to best counter that argument. There are frankly many people in America, regardless of political leanings, who have not realized why suburbanization is so problematic. So I did some research here. Allow me to mention fellow YouTuber Not Just Bikes once touched upon a visual map showing the revenue per acre in a city. The dense, walkable downtown core generates wealth far more efficiently than the suburbs and those car-centric strip malls. That by itself seems like a great argument for building more dense neighborhoods. Another fellow YouTuber, City Nerd Ray Delahanty, touched on how better urbanism can ease the quote-unquote male loneliness problem. Yeah, I used your clip at the very beginning, sorry. But despite political differences, I actually resonate a lot with this argument, because it is apparent that humans are social animals. If you're young, single, and trying to figure out life, instead of already having a steady family to raise, then I would say the suburbia and the countryside simply cannot provide you enough opportunities to socialize or find your niche communities. Example is myself. I'm a competitive ping pong player, And I've found that, at least in North America, only the larger cities with prominent Asian populations tend to have good quality table tennis clubs. You just cannot find such communities in the middle of nowhere. You may not have realized this, but suburban sprawl in the US happened because of a series of policies that every fiscal conservative should oppose. For example, the US used to have a booming and competitive railroad market where private companies are responsible for all those transcontinental railroads as well as inner-city streetcar lines. We know that public transit and dense, walkable neighborhoods, they're always correlated, they go together. Then in the 1950s, the federal government started funding the construction of the interstate highway system, where the money largely came from gas tax. Sure, I don't fully oppose the idea of a nationalized highway system itself, but highways at that time were poorly planned so that numerous inner-city neighborhoods were demolished to make way for them. And suburban sprawl started since then, not to mention enormous amount of tax money are continuously being used to fund them for decades. As a result, the once prospering passenger railroad market in the US took an absolute deep plunge. And the founding of Amtrak in the 1970s, yet another federal government project, didn't help much to revive rail transit. In one of my past videos comparing government versus private sector in rail transit, I've explained why private money is destined to perform better on this issue, at least in America, so make sure you go watch that. Second, let's talk about zoning. This is a city planning technique that started in the early 1900s US and was later ruled constitutional by a Supreme Court case. It was meant to give police power to local municipalities to geographically separate heavy polluting industries from residential areas, as well as to regulate building setbacks, at least in Manhattan, New York, to ensure natural street lighting, until zoning started regulating way more than just that. In light of the automobile boom, municipalities started largely implementing the infamous single-family residential zoning and parking requirements for businesses. Essentially, suburban residents now have no choice but to drive everywhere because of how the city is being planned. But on a digression, the liberals like to argue that single-family zoning is a racist practice because it essentially barred people of color from being able to afford these nicer houses on the periphery of the city, which was absolutely true before the civil rights movement, of course. I just don't think that's the case anymore. Nevertheless, if you're a proponent of small government, you should still oppose these land use regulations because you don't want the government to tell you what I can or cannot do on my own land, right? If your property is zoned by your city government as quote-unquote residential, then you just cannot build a small urban farm or open a coffee shop. Now here's a twist. There is actually a very good kind of zoning practice to combat these endless urban sprawl and car-centric developments into the precious farmlands and the wilderness. A common policy practice that many places have implemented is the urban growth boundary, typically enforced by zoning on the local or state level. For a city with a UGB, land outside the boundary would be zoned as agricultural or natural, and housing developers cannot legally build on these types of zoning. Therefore, conserving natural land and incentivizing developers and municipalities to make the existing urban space more dense and sustainable. Yes, sure, zoning is a pretty complex and controversial topic, and I might do another future video just on this concept. But hear me out. You may not know that the first American city to implement the UGB was actually Lexington, Kentucky in 1958, a rather conservative place instead of the left-wing Oregon in 1980. The reason Lexington did that was out of concern for urban development encroaching on the city's many historic horse farms, which are a central component in the city's identity. I hope you see that the idea to legally limit suburban developments is not merely a liberal agenda. With the development boundary, conservative rural residents can also be freed from the constant pressure of suburban expansion, loss of farmlands, and cultural identity, as well as skyrocketing property taxes. Because, as you know, prominent land for future development tends to have a high appraised value for property taxation, which is a significant economic burden in states with high property rates, such as the Republican stronghold of Texas. So that is why I say I'm very supportive of UGBs, I know this is a big topic. I'll be making a part 2 video of how you can be both right-wing yet also urbanist at the same time. I'll explain how minimalism in architecture killed the beauty of modern cities, how bad policy hurts everyone in a major city, not just conservatives, and why massive highway constructions are a stupid waste of money. These are all valid arguments that I hear from both progressive urbanists and conservatives make all the time. Stay tuned.